Welcome to the TLSIG podcast. We've got a language teaching theme today for listeners outside of English for academic purposes. I'll just go through a few acronyms that we refer to in the conversation. This podcast is actually a product of BALIP's TLSIG. I don't think I've ever really elaborated on these acronyms. So BALIP is the British Association of Lecturers in English for Academic Purposes. And the TLSIG is part of the BALIP family, Technology Enhanced Learning Special Interest Group. I appreciate we've got quite a broad church of listeners now, from learning technologists, learning developers, and everyone involved in higher education and beyond. So there you go. There's a bit of jargon to start your day. My name's Phil Martin. I'm from the University of York. And over the next few episodes, maybe 2 or 3, we're not quite decided yet, we're going to be looking at the question of, are we still language teachers? And this came about through some of the webinars that we host. TLSIG also has a series on webinars, see our YouTube channel. A lot of these focused on kind of increasing calls for some kind of AI training to be embedded in the existing provision. So this is like student-facing, teaching them about the issues of the day surrounding AI. And I think there are quite a few reasons why this sounds sensible. So students' use of AI, obviously in tools like machine translation, they've had this massive impact on everything from classroom dynamics to the kind of work we're seeing submitted and then we're marking. So it seems like teaching does need to adapt to these realities. Certainly with the current climate in higher education at the moment, it does feel like it's quite important that we keep our practice current and relevant. So, with that in mind, we're really back into EAP over the next few episodes. Zooming in on the details, though, we need to think about how realistic it is for language teachers to deliver lessons on things like effective prompting, how to interpret AI assessment scales, or becoming arbitrators on ethical issues of the day. So with that in mind, we're going to be talking to a series of EAP specialists who are dealing with these issues and more. The first one, I'm talking today with Paul Breen, who's Senior Digital Learning Developer and Lecturer in EAP at University College London, Centre for Languages and International Education. And Paul's quite widely published. He's a big name in educational technology, language, identity, social justice. The most recent book was Developing Educators in the Digital Age. So links to that in the show notes. Paul and I actually go way back. He was my first boss in EAP back in London. So you hear us mention working together in London back here, part of this interview. So that's what that's about. Anyway, more of this to come. There's a lot of subtopics to cover in this, and we're going to do our best to have these episodes build on each other over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Each one will provide something of interest to people thinking about how best to deal with this in EAP and where EAP is all going. And without further delay, I bring you Dr. Paul Breen. All right, we're live. Welcome, Paul. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you?
If we could somehow parachute in an EAP practitioner from 20 years ago into a modern day classroom, how well prepared do you think they would be to teach their class?
I think it wouldn't maybe be quite as radical yet as somebody from the 19th century turning up in the 20th century and looking at traffic on the roads or whatever. But at the same time, I imagine there would be a lot of shock at the ways in which students can now use generative AI and the way in which staff can now use generative AI in order to produce written output, and just what it has done in terms of the way that we look at plagiarism and authenticity of voice and so on. So I imagine that one of the first things that would radically change is the sense of ourselves as gatekeepers or of policing students, because it would be so much harder. And yet at the same time, a lot of the core principles of what we do remain the same. So in some ways, it might actually give us another kind of freedom to be creative. I suppose, too, one of the big issues for people would be that a lot of the technologies or a lot of the platforms that 10 or 15 years ago were considered to be untouchable are now not so much obsolete, but almost forgotten about. Like yesterday in class, I was talking about Wikipedia, and I asked my dissertation writing students if they ever had a lecturer mention the word Wikipedia. And they said, no, nobody's ever referred to it in a course. So, 20 years ago, we would have been telling students, don't use Wikipedia. Then we were telling them, don't use Grammarly. And now I think it's Chat GPT. So I think we'd be surprised at the way in which the whole thing has evolved.
But so if we're training EAP teachers, and I know there are TEEP courses like the ones that run at Leeds, what is it should we be refining things like the Value TEEP framework and the kind of core competencies that we're including on these training courses?
Yeah, I think that for a long time, I think Value has recognised that there has to be more of an emphasis on technology in there and probably on digital literacy. I suppose it's just situating it in there, and the fact that can be difficult to do because across institutions there's such a different perspective on the usage of this and what people are doing, and we're all working with very different levels of student. For example, previously I have worked in places such as, Intu's University of East Anglia or the University of Westminster, and the students there have very different needs and very different levels of proficiency compared to where I am now in UCL. So I suppose the big challenge in doing this would be trying to find something that can be universal across contexts. Maybe that's why it hasn't been done, but definitely there is a need to, I would use the word, and I know Alex Dean likes this terminology as well, I would prefer to talk about educating teachers rather than training them as well, and educating them in being more proficient themselves in using these new technologies, but also thinking of ways in which they can use them in a manner that doesn't make them shortcuts to learning for either themselves or for the students. Because I think that research is starting to bear this out. I mean, there was a paper out recently from MIT about the physical impact of Chat GPT and generative AI on the human brain, which sort of echoed some of the stuff that Mark Prensky and people like that were doing 20 years ago. So I think we need to educate teachers to use this in a way that's productive, ethical, and purposeful.
Mm-hmm. So let's just linger a minute on the student needs, because you mentioned that there was quite a stark difference between the students that you were dealing with when we were back in London and the students that you've got in your current role at UCL. So can you flesh out that a little bit? How are the students different, and what are the needs of the students in higher education in 2025? If we're trying to bring up, we talk about language proficiency, general academic skills and all the rest of it, but how are these pictures different?
I suppose the first thing I'll say is I don't want to go down the road of saying that there's necessarily a difference in terms of integrity, because this is one of the unfortunate things of the present time. And I think I saw that recently in an event that Duolingo organised in London, where I think Jack Straw turned up to speak, and he had this sense of demarcation between like the Russell Group universities and all the rest. In somehow the students in Russell Group universities are more virtuous. He didn't use that word, but he used other terminology. And I wouldn't want to go down that road. So I'm not saying that students in the more proficient students are less likely to use this in a way that helps them to cheat. But what I'm saying is the nature of assessment and the constant emphasis on proficiency, which in itself is kind of becoming outdated in an age of so much translation software and so on. The assessment regimes that we have in place tend to be much stricter for international students of a lower language level, and they're probably subject to far more scrutiny in terms of institutional scrutiny and government scrutiny and so on. So for those students, and Jan MacArthur has written a lot about this, they live almost in a state of fear in some senses, in that, they're already slaves to technology in the sense of everything going through Turnitin, and we have an assessment regime that's kind of based around Turnitin. So I think maybe when you get to the higher levels, there is a different way that students are being assessed. I know at UCL, for example, students are doing a lot more work in areas like producing podcasts as a form of assessment, or doing not oral examinations, but kind of oral output for their assessments and so on, or team portfolio assessments and so on. Whereas maybe in many of the foundation courses or the pre-sessional courses that EAP people are involved in, then perhaps it's not as easy to have that sort of more creative form of assessment. So I think our less proficient students are more constrained and maybe more likely to have forms of assessment that lend themselves to the temptation to use generative AI to help them, if that makes sense.
Okay. So I want to go back to the bit where you mentioned language proficiency, because I think to me, this is at the heart of the conversation. So when I say, are we still just language teachers? Is language proficiency, how important is language proficiency in going to another country and studying a degree at the moment? Because I think, and just to add a couple of things here, I think the kind of English that we used to teach back in the day, so this English for academic purposes, I think the point was often made that it's not, good writing is something that eludes a lot of native speakers as well. Even if English is your first language, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can communicate, especially in writing, to the standard that we're expected at higher education institutions. And thrown into that was this idea that when machine translation came along, it was acting as a kind of leveler for international students. So there was a kind of, they were disadvantaged to start with because they might be really knowledgeable in their subject and keen to get into their field, but they had this additional barrier of having to learn English, which they didn't necessarily sign up for and probably may not be interested in. So machine translation comes along and then they can effectively operate at the same level as the home students. But then that was the point at which questions started to be raised about authenticity, how much of this is the student's voice if it's being mediated through a third party. And then when Chat GPT came along, you had not exactly the same, but similar arguments being made about these. It's a tool for putting your ideas in a certain format that's compliant with the conventions of higher education. So you don't really need to learn how to structure pieces of academic writing anymore. ChatGPT will do that for you. It's all about your ideas. So again, there's this sort of theme as these technologies as being a leveler. And what's your view on that? And has it diminished the need to be proficient in the language in which you're studying?
I think there's a lot in that question and the sub-questions. And the first thing that came to mind, and I've heard so many EAP practitioners and even so many people within the other disciplines repeatedly say this. I speak a little bit of Korean. I tried to learn Chinese. I kind of gave up because Chinese in an Irish accent just doesn't work. But I would never dream of going to China to do a degree in Mandarin or going to Korea to do a degree in Korean. So yes, proficiency in a language is important at some level, but I suppose maybe we're moving into more of an environment where there's a greater emphasis on translanguaging, switching between languages. And I have seen very good instances of that in the classroom. And in real life, I have seen Chinese students in a workshop that I ran in China once give fantastic presentations, 90% in English, 10% in Chinese. And that was a skill in itself. And so I think that the nature of how we measure proficiency, while it hasn't changed at a government level and seems to be becoming even more strict, on the ground, I think in universities, there is a greater emphasis on the fact that we are multilingual spaces. And I think there should be more room allowed for that. And in some ways, the use of generative AI, alongside our natural voices is a kind of translanguaging. I've had Professor Leeway from the Institute of Education say something similar in a podcast that I did with All Things EAP. So I think we have to take into account that we're now in a new reality where this thing exists, and it is changing the way in which students can produce output. But at the same time, I've had neurodiverse students, because we teach mixed classes of international and home. I can't actually remember whether they were second language speakers, but they were saying that generative AI, one girl said that generative AI now allows her to say what her brain wants to say and could if it wasn't scrambled by dyslexia. I thought that was brilliant. I think the nature of this whole thing is changing, but unfortunately too, we do know that, there are students who probably would give in to the temptation of using this as a shortcut. So maybe it's about how we as EAP practitioners, how we instill in students a sense of ethical usage of AI, and how we just give students an awareness that studying a degree isn't just about coming in, going through the motions and getting that certificate. But again, unfortunately, we're up against a lot, because with the marketization of higher education, increasingly that's what it does feel like, that they are coming in purely for the certification. So maybe part of our role as EAP professionals is to just give students a sense of us developing them, not just as writers or as participants in their disciplines, but also in the wider world beyond that, if that makes sense.
There's a couple of directions in your answer there that would be interesting to explore, but we'll just do, because the bit you mentioned about neurodiversity, and I think that's really interesting, and I can see some links there to things like the MIT study and the literature like that that's been coming out recently. So we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to do a bit of a follow-up on the language proficiency point. So and the role of the AP teachers now, because I think if you said, let's take the statement you said about instilling ethical use of Gen AI and general awareness raising, things like that. How equipped do you think EAP teachers are to do this, and is this a fair thing for them to be doing? Because this, to me, is suddenly how much technical knowledge would teachers need to know in order to sort of reinvent themselves as, albeit a guide on the side, but who could talk through the myriad ethical issues there are with generative AI use, guide students through appropriate use policy that would include touching on assignment briefs that might be traffic light coded in their other subjects. And this to me seems like something that would just could potentially be all consuming. And at best, there's a very tenuous link here to language proficiency. So if we're still saying that there is a role for language proficiency, and we don't want to abandon that altogether, what EAP teaches core skills and knowledge of language awareness is important. But how do we marry those two concepts up? Because it seems to be they're completely different knowledge areas, they're completely different skill sets. The teaching would be completely different. It's not ethical AI use is not something that gels at all naturally with the way we've been teaching language proficiency. So how do you see these two working together?
I can see them working together quite naturally for some people and being a challenge for others. For example, going back to my work in UCL, we have a good example of how you can marry the two things together. So we run generative AI workshops on integrating AI into the writing process, and we teach students about ethical use of generative AI in the writing process, in the drafting process. And so even though the focus is on generative AI to some extent, the essence of what we're doing is still teaching students how to produce their dissertations and their written work. So again, I know some people don't like this idea, and it's one that comes from my PhD studies and maybe research that some would say is getting a little bit outdated now. The idea that this isn't a radical break from the past, that this is a continuum. I know some people don't like that they think this is completely different to anything that we've seen before. But the same was said 30 years ago. And what I'm trying to say there is a continuum between what we're doing now with generative AI and what we were doing 20 years ago with things like Turnitin, in running sessions on how students should avoid plagiarism because of the policing system of Turnitin or whatever. So we were teaching them to understand how they could be detected through plagiarism software and why, therefore, they should learn to paraphrase, learn to summarize, learn to reference properly. So there is scope for having the traditional EAP skill set in a generative AI landscape, I think. And again, using the UCL example, we teach dissertation writing workshops. I feel lucky. I teach social sciences and arts and humanities students. There are other sessions that I've taught, like maths and physical sciences, life students, life sciences, health sciences, whatever. And I'm not an expert in that subject area, but I need to touch on it in some way. So I need to have some awareness of it. And to do that, I tend to draw on the students themselves and their experiences. But essentially, I'm still teaching students how to write dissertations. And it's the same set of core ideas that I would use in any EAP classroom, transferred into the context of life sciences or maths, physical sciences. So in the same way, I would adapt or integrate traditional EAP teaching with this new world that we face.
How long is the generative AI workshop at UCL been running?
The generative AI workshop has been running for about 2 years, and each session is 2 hours. Sometimes they've kind of evolved and kept up to date with developments and so on. Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of changes in that time. Students are becoming more fluent in the usage of generative AI tools. At UCL, we have an institutional Copilot system, Microsoft Copilot, which students are allowed to use. But I think in general, what those sessions do is they take away some of the mystique around generative AI, some of the taboo, and they allow students to contextualize that in the broader landscape of the other technologies that they are using in their studies, whether or not that's the Moodle virtual learning platform or whether or not it's other stuff like Zotero, OneNote, and so on.
Okay, so what sort of things would you include? So you in your workshop, I take it you've mentioned ethical issues. Do you do things like working with prompts and this, treating Chat GPT as an iterative partner rather than a search engine? Okay.
But also just simple ethical things that I think people need to be aware of. Students need to be aware of. We need to be aware of. I subscribe to Chat GPT because I think that's part of my job is to know what's happening. Even though personally, with some of Chat GPT's recent military investments, for example, I'm having second thoughts about that, and the lack of transparency over who actually owns many of these companies and so on. But I have used ChatGPT, just having it open and looking for a synonym, for example. But the amount of energy that these large language models use, even compared to Google, is, I don't have the figures with me now, but it's something insane. And we try to make students aware of the fact that these things don't exist in a moral or ethical vacuum. And they shouldn't just be used casually all the time because there are environmental consequences, there are ethical consequences, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree, and I'd add on to that the issue around cognitive offloading in these studies that we were talking about earlier, and this growing bodies of literature on the effect that cognitive shortcuts are taking on long-term skills, and I think that's. But if we add all this to a pile of ethical issues that we want to touch on in an AI/EAP course, it's back to this original point of, if we had a teacher from 20 years ago, so they've been a status for the past 2 decades, and just thinking about how much catching up they'd have to do, because I think these are issues, even if you are kind of curating content and guiding students through a certain amount of articles and knowledge base, and having, not claiming to be a subject matter expert yourself on any of these issues, but simply acting as a facilitator. Even with that in mind, it's still something that you would have to be up to speed on with a lot of these issues, and they are so fast moving. I mean, you take the copyright issues going on at the moment in the UK. This is changing on a weekly basis, and you bearing in mind that traditional skill sets of EAP teachers were knowledge of things like systemic functional linguistics, language research methods, which were often, they didn't change for decades, and suddenly we've got to keep up with this daily churn of technological changes and new ethical dilemmas which we weren't aware of for the energy issue which you mentioned. So yeah, back to this kind of questions: how well equipped are teachers? Because I don't think any of this has made its way into official teacher training courses, although it could be wrong. So if these are becoming things that we need to be paying attention to as language teachers who prepare students for studying higher education, it seems like we've got a lot of overhauling to do and a lot of training that needs to be disseminated in a way that I'm not sure we're set up to do at the moment. I mean,
no, I'm not. So if I can say, I think you mentioned TEEP courses and things earlier on. There's also a school of thought within EAP that might argue that we should steer away from areas like learning development, digital learning development, teaching students about use of technologies and AI, because our main role is unpacking language and teaching students how to write. So in some ways there's a mystique around what we do with language, and that's part of the reason why we're not in the margins. I'm not sure we're in the margins. Certainly in my present role, I don't feel like I'm in the margins. In many of our institutions, we're becoming more prominent within them as EAP departments, even though there's unfortunately, a lot of other cases where language departments are being closed down. But I think a large part of what we do and what we're seen to do is to deal with those elements of language that those in the disciplines can't deal with or don't necessarily want to deal with. So I suppose there may be a reluctance to bring too much of this into the development mainstream, or to make this too much a part of our jobs. Because the other argument is, well, if language is our thing, then maybe the people already within the disciplines, they are as capable of teaching this as we are. But where I would say we have a strength, and I don't think we use this often enough in EAP or act as advocates for ourselves, our experience really is in working with international students and effectively translating these ideas into a format that they can understand. So we're like a conduit for a lot of the academic conventions and a lot of the practices that they need to learn, that others with less experience or that context might struggle with. So maybe within EAP teacher education courses, there does need to be more of an emphasis on why we have a particular skill set that's not limited to working on areas of language alone.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose there's a fear within that we don't want to, because skills, academic skills became a term that got so heavily associated with library services and professional services. People are maybe a little bit hesitant to touch that. So I don't know if that has answered the question, but that's just my thoughts on how maybe we need a slightly different emphasis in developing our teachers.
Yeah, I think what you said about it, the point about what, if we can do it, why aren't, can other teachers of other subjects not do the same thing? These are conversations that are happening. A lot of subjects are just so-called embedding AI into their teaching, be that in the form of their assessments, the things they cover in class, the everything from working with prompts to, the ethical issues of how much assistance is acceptable, etc. These are being incorporated into subjects across faculties. So I think it's an open question as to whether or not EAP and these hub disciplines are being looked at for support. I think they probably are still, because I know all the things that we've talked about are concerns that other teachers will have, just being equipped to discuss ethical issues and things like that.
Can I maybe another thing, and this is slightly off on a tangent, but it's a question about TEEP and teacher certification courses. Are they themselves designed or intended to be a means of keeping EAP in a separate bubble away from the university, or are they designed as a means of moving us closer to the university mainstream? I don't have the answer to that, and I'm not sure I asked that question exactly the way I wanted to ask it. But what I'm thinking is, are we certifying ourselves to death? And I know others in the EAP will disagree with that. Within the disciplines, is that necessarily, who wants us as EAP teachers to have so many certificates? That's not to say people shouldn't have certification, but it's just, should we actually be learning more about practical aspects of what we do and what the disciplines are doing with things like generative AI and new technologies? Because I'm seeing courses, I don't want to single out any, but I'm seeing courses like, for example, I'll just make one, how to be a better EAP coordinator.
All right.
Do we really need courses like that in the age that we're living in? Because surely general management training courses or whatever, or even research training components of master's courses and PhD courses should give you the skill set that you maybe need and then gradually develop in the role. Would we be better with, as you're saying, more of an emphasis on these practical areas, like how do we use generative AI in our practice? And there's those are things that we haven't even touched on. Can we use generative AI in the design of assessments? Can we use generative AI in things like systematic literature reviews, which I was very surprised at when I went to an event in a UCL department, having been telling the students that they shouldn't use generative AI to generate literature reviews. Someone in the department was saying, go ahead and use it. It's a shortcut. It allows you more time to actually look at key articles rather than sifting through 200 articles and deciding which ones are best.
Well, I think that's a massive topic, which I think we could do a podcast in its own right. I mean, I'm really interested in the research that's coming out and the effects of all of this. And well, let's, I'm aware we're up against the clock at the moment, but I think, I'm not sure if we've actually answered our questions. Are we just language teachers? I think we started off saying language proficiency is important. We've got these other caveats in play here as well. So I think at the moment it's a firm yes, but not entirely. So maybe no, we're not just language teachers anymore.
We are and we aren't, because going to go back to what I was saying about translanguaging, generative AI produced language is now a part of world languages in its own way. It's obviously not an original language in that it is largely generated from existing input. But we are still, in our work with generative AI, with the change in writing practices, or in the vanguard of protecting against changes in writing practices. Maybe we are still language teachers. We're just contending with a new language landscape where you have tools that make translation and production so much easier, and we just haven't yet learned how to get our heads around this.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think the big takeaway I wanted to be from these episodes that we're running is, the landscape being what it is at the moment, with people just worried about job security and really staying relevant. I think these questions about what we need to be teaching, what the purpose of the AP and its related disciplines are, is really important, and we need to sort this out so that we can make a case that the knowledge base that we do have is valuable and can be adapted and can help students really flourish in their degrees, which I think is kind of one of the core purposes of English for academic purposes, was to help students across disciplines do the best they can in their work. And I think it's just thinking about how we do that now and what ways in which we need to adapt.
Yeah, I think we still are hugely relevant to the university, and I would even go so far as to say, you mentioned about job cuts and so on. I would predict, having been in this environment for about 20 years, we do see these cycles of boom and bust and cuts and rehires and so on. I would think that very soon many of the institutions that are cutting provision for international students will realise that they've made a mistake, because what we provide is absolutely essential to the life of the university, and especially with less proficient students as well.
Nice one. On that note, cheers, Paul. Thank you very much. This conversation is to be continued.
Yeah, thanks.